Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the year, and what better way to conclude the year than with some shit that Spotify basically started but everyone seems to be copying, like Wrapped. Honestly, the thought of it is actually quite interesting because people are being given data in such a fun way that when you sit and you actually think about it, it's actually very, very intelligent. Like, they made giving you data on the stuff that you listen to absolutely fun. Like, it's actually particularly interesting. But anyways, that was actually the inspiration for this episode, as you know, the title has probably shown you. But all in all, I should definitely get into the details of the Wrapped, or the idea of a Wrapped that I had for this particular episode. Although before I can do that, I should have started with an intro, because where are my manners? So, welcome to the Breakdown Podcast, where I talk about love, sex, and relationships from a guy's perspective, as well as a bunch of other guy shit. The man on the mic is Sir Denver. This is a shorter, less edity, no instrumentally version of the podcast where I basically come and spew out some of my thoughts that I didn't manage to put into a full episode. And, it's basically like a much shorter episode that, is usually there during the holidays. But it's usually my thoughts or some of the content that I find which I didn't manage to feature in, the longer length episodes that ran for 12 weeks. Now, with that said, I'm not gonna lie, this was something that popped up almost like a very wild idea that I came up with, where I was like, you know what, I've seen Spotify Wrapped, I've seen YouTube Music, or at least YouTube's version, which is, YouTube Recap. I don't know what the fuck Apple Music called theirs, because I don't have Apple Music, but I'm guessing maybe they also call it Wrapped. But all in all, I saw what they were doing, and I was like, you know what, if people are this jazzed by information on, some of the activities that happened over the past year, and this was in terms of music, something that people don't usually give a fuck about data for, then what if I gave one on relationships, or at least the dating scene, or, the topic of relationships and dating, as I've seen it unfold on the internet and even out here in these streets. So I figured, you know what, let me do a Wrapped 2025 as well, but now mine is the dating edition, or at least the dating market edition, because there's some things that I've noticed over the past year that I feel need to be mentioned, not necessarily so that you go out and you change the dating market, but so that you can also notice that things aren't all the same. Last year there was man versus bear, and women were busy going for the bear, and it divided a couple of people. But this year was different. It wasn't man versus bear anymore. It was women asking where the men were after they chose the bear, and the men were busy trying to fight a gorilla. There was a debate on, a gorilla versus 100 men who would win. That was probably one of the more interesting parts of early this year. And, it happened. I know it's not necessarily related to dating and relationships, but, it is proof that things were actually shifting. But all in all, there were a couple of things that I noticed that I felt, should be given some prominence, and I should definitely mention them. Because I don't have all of time. I don't have that much time anyways. So I compiled my Wrapped into about 5 points. And in my opinion, I feel like they properly encapsulate the dating market and just the social media scene as far as dating and relationships is concerned for this year. So without wanting to take too much time, I'll just get into them. So the first point that I noticed is that almost everyone is complaining about the dating market, but it's more and it's louder this year. And let me try and put some context to this. Literally, every single person, and I mean it in every sense of the word, every single person has been complaining about how bad the dating market is and how full of shit it is. And it's been a particularly interesting thing because, it's not like people haven't been complaining about the dating market, but this year, it's every single person is complaining about it. Even people in relationships are complaining about how shit the dating market is, and it's louder than ever. So it's more people and it's louder, which is interesting because, this is the first time when I've actually heard that, there's a collective agreement that the dating market is shit. Usually you'd hear some people saying, oh, it's not all that bad. Oh, there's hope out here. But everyone, literally everyone has been saying that the dating market is full of shit. But with that said, every single person that's complaining about the dating market seems to be forgetting that they are also a part of the dating market, save for those that are taken and are faithful. So essentially, like, they're just complaining about the entire market, forgetting that they are also a part of the same shit. So if they collectively chose to make the dating market better, things would be better. But that's a little bit more of a pipe dream. So I'm going to leave it at that. But the truth of the matter is, everyone seems to believe that the dating market has a lot of issues that need to be resolved. It's just that, we're all waiting for everyone else to resolve their issues. But all in all, with that said, I am going to leave it at that and move it on to our second point, which is the high value man, or at least the moniker of the high value man, has basically been unseated and replaced by the provider or the provider man. Now, this is something that has happened in a bit more of a subtle manner as opposed to it being like all out there. And the only way that I managed to pick up on it was the fact that people stopped talking about finding a high value man or finding a great guy, and I started hearing more women talking about wanting a provider. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not like this language originated this year. I would say that it's mostly been popularized this year as the idea of the high value man started to come down, and the idea of the provider seems a lot more realistic to a lot of people. Now, for those of y'all that might not understand what a provider is, much as it might sound a bit self-explanatory, it's basically the idea of a man that is all about provision. They're the kind of guy that will pay the bills, that will handle the rent, that, want to make sure that they take care of their partner through provision. How they show love, how they show affection and care is basically by paying the bills. Like ensuring that they provide. If they're going out on dates, he's the one that's sorting out the bill and everything, so that the babe doesn't feel like she has to, go into her bag and look for the money, or, use her money and shit. And I remember having a debate with someone who was saying that you don't need to have a lot of money to be a provider, which makes it sound even more realistic. But essentially, it's just a sugar-coated version of saying, I want a guy that pays bills. So if you're that kind of guy, then, this is your time to shine. And if there's a babe that feels like, oh my goodness, Denver, it's more than just paying bills. Well, unfortunately, that's like the main part of it. So however you want to phrase it, that's kind of what it is. And the reason I say that it's unseated or basically replaced the moniker of the high value man is because the high value man has basically been the idea or the ideal that a lot of women online and even, out here in these streets basically say that they want a certain kind of man to be, or the ideal partner to be, for them to be considered an ideal partner. Now, the idea of what a high value man is has sort of kind of fluctuated here and there, but essentially this was a term that was brought up by the late Kevin Samuels, and it was a term that was being universally used by both men and women because it did a lot better of a job as opposed to the previous term, which used to be used as a moniker, which was the alpha male, which kind of was taken a shit on and was very misused and abused, more so by the red pill community, to the point where it ended up giving people quite a bad taste whenever they said it. Even to this day, there's people out here that would not want to be termed alpha males or just get disgusted by the term alpha male. So, high value man kind of replaced that. And, now the provider man is the one that has replaced that moniker. So with that said, I'll move it on to point number 3. The 10s, the incredibly good looking girls, the 10s, the 9s, are basically being hunted for sport at this point. By that I mean a lot of guys are going and approaching these women with the idea of just smashing, or the typical hit and run, without any form of commitment lined up or not wanting to stay with this babe. And a lot of this I can blame on the idea of delusional cynicism, which I spoke about maybe 2 if not 3 episodes ago. But essentially, for those of y'all that didn't listen to that episode, let me spoil it for myself and say I was essentially talking about this idea that men are looking at very beautiful women and are carrying the assumption that this babe is either, going to be with, I don't want to say the highest bidder, but the guy with the most money, or she'll just end up falling for a guy that is basically going to be better at you at something. So instead of trying to cuff the babe, just smash and move on. Or else, you can try and cuff her and risk being cheated on, or you try and cuff her and risk being left for some other dude that might be better at you at some shit. Which has essentially created a paradoxical situation, which I like to refer to as pretty paradox. whereby a very good looking person is looked at by potential mates as being someone that is so good looking that they have potential mates that want to be with them. And as such, they basically back themselves off from this person, which now creates a situation where this very good looking person does not have any mates or potential mates because all the potential mates have withdrawn interest in this good looking person because they believe that there are other potential mates that would create stiffer competition for them. So essentially it's like, like you're so hot that you'd get people, but because everyone else thinks that you're so hot that you'd get other people, they don't put themselves there, so you just end up with no one. So essentially that's what I believe might be happening to a lot of tens, and like that may or may not be true for some, but there's a lot of very good looking people that seem to be having that problem. But with that said, now on to the next point, and this one actually requires me to give a story. So about a month ago, I had met up with a certain friend of mine around Kilimani, so I was taking an Uber to go back home. And when I was in the Uber, I was chatting with the driver. So I basically just asked, what he's learned, from doing Uber out here in these Nairobi streets. And this guy goes on a tangent about how babes out here are really, really giving it up and, they just can't be trusted. Like there's babes out here that, you think are loyal to their boyfriends, but they're moving from one guy's place, they're going to another's place. And when they're in the Uber, they're having the Uber driver like roll up the windows, turn off the radio just so that they can be on the phone with the boyfriend and be like, oh, I'm just at home, but I'm super tired and I want to go to bed. I think I'll just talk to you in the morning. And these are babes that are also selling it. And yet these women have jobs, have sources of income that do not really require them to have to go down that route. And, he even went into this whole story about a babe that hopped from house to house to house all in one night, and she was still to go to the office the following morning. Now, don't get me wrong, like that conversation was wild, and that whole scenario is very, very wild, but that's a little bit more on the extreme end. The part that actually got to me was towards the end of that conversation, dude basically is like, if you want to get a solid babe, you should go for a single mom. Like a single mom of one, even a single mom of two will actually be very solid. And the justification that dude was giving for this was, when a baby's a single mom, she has to second guess and she has to think through her decisions and her actions because she has a kid that she needs to take care of. So they're less likely to just go and fuck around like that. So you're probably better off just going for a single mom of one or even a single mom of two. Now, with that said, the point here is single moms are on demand now. And, like no one would have really figured it, but there's a lot less stigma even online about dating a single mom. And I have noticed this, whether it's on Reddit, whether it's on IG, whether even it's on TikTok, where people aren't speaking to single moms or speaking about, the idea of dating a single mom with the same level of stigma and bile that used to be there before. So if anything, single moms seem to be a little bit more in demand. And honestly, I don't feel bad about it. I do believe that everyone is deserving of love. And, much as there was stigma before, whether on a cultural level, whether, just socially, at least a lot of it is starting to come off right now. And they are seeming like very potential dating mates. Doesn't necessarily mean that people want to like get married and like settle down and have more kids, but we've gotten to the point where people want to date a single mom, so let's celebrate that for those who would like to celebrate. Unfortunately, single dads, I haven't seen an uptick. If anything, I feel like the situation is still the same. I know there's an assumption that single dads have it easy and single dads can date out here, and there's babes that are okay with dating and being with a single dad. But I can't entirely say if that's entirely true or false. But the single moms seem to be having a demand spike right now, which is nice, I guess, for them. But anyways, that was, in my opinion, probably the wildest part of 2025. But now, last but not least, the fifth point, which is that we've started feeling the effects of empowerment, or should I say women or female empowerment, as men are now more numb than ever and are feeling more disenfranchised than ever before, and it might actually be pretty late for quite a number of them. Now, it's not like I have anything against female empowerment. Don't get me wrong. Like, if that's your thing, if you've been a product of female empowerment, then great. I do love the fact that female empowerment exists. The problem is, while the empowerment happened, a lot of men, or should I say the boy child, was ignored. And the belief that was there was that men are already privileged, boys already privileged, so they have it easy and they have it good. And as a result, the boy child was neglected for quite a while. And it is something that I've had discussions over as far back as 2015, as far as my memory goes. But it is something that I've talked about on this podcast multiple times. And we're now seeing the effects of it. There was a whole story of guys not being seen at clubs and events. We've also seen, how a lot of women nowadays are complaining that there's no guys to date. And, there was also the statistics from the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, which was talking about how out of the 15,000 plus people that started making 100K a month last year, 98% of them, or like 13,000 and something of them, were women, and the other 1,000 and something were men, which clearly shows that, there are more women making more money, but now there's a lot less guys that are getting into the 100K a month range. And that creates an issue because women are hypergamous, or at least most women are hypergamous. So it is going to be quite a bit of an issue for a lot of the guys that don't seem to be making all that much. And as a result of that, there's a lot of guys that are very numb to it. And I don't know if we can really pull back from this one. And I feel like guys from like the ages of like 22 to 35, if they are, a part of the disenfranchised, I feel like it might be pretty late for them. But if it's a guy who's like 20, maybe latest 21 and below, then we do have a chance to actually reverse whatever damages or whatever issues that the ignoring of the boy child did to a lot of society. But, with all of that said, let me just conclude by saying that 2025 has been quite an interesting year. I've had a couple of quiet wins and some quiet L's, and I believe a lot of people have as well. But I think my biggest takeaway from 2025 is the fact that people are now starting to ask what it is that the boy child needs or what it is that men need. And even though the change makers may not do shit right now, the fact that people have started asking that question at least puts us on the right path. But with all of that said, what do you think made 2025 interesting for you in the dating scene? What is it in the relationship topics bit that made 2025 for you? I'm actually quite curious to find out if, you also encountered any of these 5 or if you found some of your own. Either way, I want your thoughts on it. The DMs are open. On IG, it is at the breaktime_podcast. On Facebook, it is at the breaktime podcast. On X, it is at Bugak and on Bluesky, it is at the breaktimepod.bsky.social. Thank you so much for listening all the way till the end, and I will catch you guys on the next break.